Part 1. The Human Mind and Expectations. In the field of cognitive psychology, the total amount of information the brain is able to hold at any particular moment is called cognitive capacity, and naturally, that capacity is finite. A cognitive load refers to a given amount of that capacity required for a particular mental task. So you might be able to handle several cognitive loads at the same time, like walking and chewing gum, but if you're also trying to recite the alphabet backwards while doing some long division and solving a Rubik's Cube, you probably need to divvy that mental workload up over time, as the sum of those individual loads would otherwise exceed your total cognitive capacity. In general, people intuitively understand these concepts. When seeing someone heavily engaged in a task, you can instinctively feel that it probably isn't the best time to ask something of them because they are already near their cognitive capacity. In interactions with our fellow humans, we generally have this understanding of what we can expect their moment-to-moment cognitive capacity to be and intuitively set our expectations accordingly. In this way, what has set us apart from our fellow lifeforms is two factors. The first is the consciousness that gives us awareness of our surroundings and enables us to ask why things are as they are. And the second is the ability to make plans for the future, sacrificing short-term rewards for greater long-term gain, such as with farming and building shelters, as well as societal moral structures that have proved advantageous to the population, stemming back to ideas like Hammurabi's Code. It's at that point where complexity begins to scale up from the individual immediate perspective, and is also where views begin to diverge as to what our expectations should or should not be from each other over a given period of time, and when grouped into an organization or even a society. And that's where we run into a problem. As soon as these higher level factors are included, our expectations become infinitely more complex to form as more and more variables get applied to the situation. With these complex structures, how can we assess what the appropriate output should be in any reasonable way, socially, culturally, or economically? These are the questions we've been asking ourselves since the dawn of civilization, and are vitally important, because setting our expectations affects how we orient ourselves to the world around us. To put it simply, having them be too low will mean you are often selling yourself short, but having them be too high means you will be constantly disappointed. And on another level, as time passes and situations change, the standard to aim towards continually evolves, which makes analyzing this whole tangle a bit of a pickle. Now, I am no great philosopher, quite to the contrary, but I have on occasion thought a bit about the applications of this subject and have tried to form my observations in a way that others might find useful. Which brings us to the obvious topic I've been building towards, that is, of course, video games. Part 2. Hype culture and disappointment. When it comes to the gaming world, while not unique to it, there is one aspect that has continually vexed me, as it seems to have taken deep root, that being the concept of hype culture. Since Urban Dictionary doesn't have an entry for this, I'll define hype culture as a culture promoting and or indulging in excessive positivity or excitement for new releases in a given field. Keeping in mind what we've been saying regarding expectations, definitionally, hype culture exists on the extreme positive side of the expectation scale. And, just as is often observed of extreme optimists, the side effect of viewing the world through that lens is a tendency toward a state of disappointment, where the greater the hype, the greater the potential for disappointment will be, along with regret in having invested time, energy, and money in a product. Naturally, there are some benefits to this kind of view as well, as the more excitement and like-minded people you have to share it with, the more enjoyment you can get out of your investment in the product. And while there's nothing wrong with this in of itself, it should be noted that this effect doesn't in any way improve or generally speak to the quality of the product itself. In my time observing the gaming world, I believe hype culture to be a real sore on the side of the industry, creating bad incentives for all parties and ultimately giving us worse products that degrade the industry as a whole. Here are the factions to be aware of. On the one hand, there are the developers and their partners, who have direct financial incentive in getting as many people excited or at a minimum aware of their game as possible, through whatever means available, because interest equals sales, and that's just the bottom line. It's only natural that they would selectively reveal information and highlights from their product to cast it in the best possible light, which can leave consumers, once they see the full, finished product, disappointed and regretful if they don't feel their expectations have been met sufficiently. As with any growing business, once a developer hits a certain size and scope, the priority of short-term financial success and stability can outstrip creativity, innovation, and core player enjoyment as business incentives, and generally leads to a slow decline in those aspects as the company simply struggles to maintain its bloated size, which can eventually lead to the scales tipping and the business going belly up. It's the natural cycle of any institution. On the other hand is us, the consumer hordes. This side of hype culture is a more complex subject, but in addition to genuine interest in a release, a combination of factors such as brand loyalty, fear of missing out, the good old sunk cost effect, and the cultural desire to remain homogeneously optimistic, all mix together to form a short-term incentive structure for consumers to disregard or simply downplay concerns they may have for a product others are excited about so as not to harsh their buzz. The logical conclusion of this kind of thinking is best exemplified in the concept of the game pre-order. Since limited distribution or availability of games has long since ceased to be a justifiable reason to reserve a copy of a game in our current digital era, in modern times this has become a practice where consumers pay money ahead of time for unfinished games and effectively send the message that we don't care to know what the game is going to be when it's finished, shut up and take our money anyway, which can lead developers to start counting their chickens well before they hatch. This and other facets of the hype-based superstructure exists as a separate metric from the quality of the underlying product, which therefore leads to a flip side of this effect in the form of a natural contrarian response from those who feel a product is overly praised or marketed for its actual quality. Although in my experience, these groups generally have little effect in discouraging the main demographic of consumers for good or ill. There is one other group to mention here that can be thought of as the legitimized form of us in the whiny baby demographic, that being the reviewer class. Self-appointed or otherwise, this group shares their opinion on published media ostensibly to convey information about the content and quality of a product so as to inform consumer purchasing decisions. Naturally, this group of trusted individuals and organizations has an ability to raise or lower expectations with their reviews for a particular work. And while ideally this group would maintain its status as a third-party, objective-esque reporter of facts and honest impressions informed by knowledge of the industry, various factors can pressure reviewers to be less forthright with opinions, which for our purposes here includes obvious practices such as paid reviews, but perhaps even more insidiously, the modern reality of access journalism, where reviewers, consciously or otherwise, feel the need to maintain good relations with companies by obscuring facts or even simply softening criticism in their reviews in order to maintain various benefits for themselves or their publication, such as early access, free review copies, release parties, and so on. In this way, even parties with genuine passion and interest, when selectively singled out and given special access, can be utilized to make a reviewer or influencer effectively a part of the marketing wing of a company. And if you think I'm worrying about this kind of thing too much, don't take my word for it, just ask my man Tom.
Now, the lines aren't always clear. It's standard practice in car journalism for reviewers to be given cars to test drive for free. It's unreasonable for a journalist to buy a brand new car for each review, so often manufacturers will lend them one for a few days on the expectation that they'll get a review out of it. It's a perk of the job. Is that payment? If that journalist writes too many bad reviews about a particular car company or they've got a reputation for being really honest or tough, maybe they won't be quite as high on the list for those test drives next time. Is that control? Does that count as an advert? Can a journalist be trusted to give an unbiased review after that? Would that be an advert?
It's true that if the public recognizes that these reviews seem dishonest, that a corrupted reviewer can lose the trust of their audience. But often this influence is hard to spot or subtle, so that process can take a long time to have any effect. And so at any given time, it falls to the public to use their individual judgment to find honest actors and on their own separate fact from fiction. So as you can see, no matter which group in the gameosphere you fall into, there are a variety of influences that can pressure one to be overly optimistic about an upcoming project, leading to our twin cruel mistresses, disappointment and regret. They go hand in hand with too much optimism, and while being overly pessimistic can have its own share of issues, to me, the myriad pressures that induce a reluctance to be critical, in healthy, productive ways, is a far bigger issue for the industry. And so, I had an idea. I had been mulling over this stuff for a long time, looking for a way to condense some ideas into a more easily articulated concept, to give people a tool that allows reference to these ideas put into a visualization that they can easily share. When your buddy Billy leans over and says, "Are you excited for this new revolutionary game that is going to totally change your understanding of what games can do? Or even are?" and you have some reservations about these claims. I want to help you be able to point to a reason as to why that is, in at least the way I think about it, without him just brushing you off as overly critical. So, here is an idea that helps one keep in mind a healthy skepticism for what the current cognitive capacity of today's technology is likely to be able to achieve, to combat against overly rosy expectations. I call it the MMICUL. Part 3. MMICUL. MMICUL stands for Multimedia Intellectual Complexity Upper Limit, and is a value derived from this generalized equation here. It shows the theoretical limit approached by the curve representing intellectual complexity over development time and energy as it increases, showing how complex a multimedia product can theoretically become given the limits of available technology. This line here is the MMICUL coefficient. Since the development of our first computer-generated media, at any given point in time, there has been a certain level of development of computing technology that can be used to make that media. Poly count, number of objects on screen, the interactions of all those objects, etc. Calculating all of these in as many frames per second as possible requires more and more system resources. And as time progresses, we've seen ongoing improvements to computations per second, available memory, speed of memory access, and so on, which, for our purposes here, means an ability to handle more complexity of design at runtime. And thus we've been able to go from Pong to something like Grand Theft Auto 5. But at any particular point in time, that technology had only reached a particular level, an ability to handle up to a certain digital cognitive capacity. So there were limitations on what was possible to produce at that point in time. And the more you try to squeeze out of the hardware, the more difficult it will be to get more complexity. Which is why you wouldn't see something like Grand Theft Auto 5 in 1972. That theoretical limit for a given point in time is the Multimedia Intellectual Complexity Upper Limit, or the MMICUL. You might have noticed that the MMICUL graph depicts a similar concept to the idea of diminishing returns, but specifically, MMICUL focuses on the complexity of systems contained within media, not the total content or the quality of the product. It's not intended to be thought of as a tool to quantify exact values, but to serve as a rule of thumb guide to keep in mind when considering these subjects. In short, this is how I see things. Which isn't to say that there is no way to have a reasonable concept of the current MMICUL value, imprecise though it may be. Even as a consumer who is simply observing the new release landscape, you can get a sense of the graphical expectations for the AAA scene, for example, and by keeping your ear to the ground and playing a few of the standout games of the time, you can get a feel for what the gameplay is typically like for those modern games, as well as the depth of the worlds within them. How detailed they are, how alive and responsive they feel, how many options you have to interact with and control that world, and so on. Of course, it's perfectly fair to consider how the economic realities of the development cycle restrains developers' desires to implement further complexity into their games than what they put out for commercial release, but at a certain point, specific hardware and a release date has to be settled upon for any piece of software, which can often be helpful to the process of taking a game from theoretical into a realized state, even with some potentially fixable imperfections. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, as they say. You don't want to end up as a Star Citizen, or dare I say, a yandere simulator. Let alone a Best Enemy Ever Ghost in the Shell, am I right? Hey! So in short, everyone with exposure to this medium forms in their mind a concept of the current MMICUL. These individual interpretations will range widely, too high, too low, with selective blind spots or not, but nonetheless, this expectation forms automatically. There is also a secondary value here that is useful to keep in mind, that being consumer expectations for a particular developer or product. That refers to the consumer's overall expectations of what the project will deliver, which, when it comes to technological and complexity-based expectations, can be mapped onto our MMICUL chart like so. For healthy consumer relations, obviously that value should always be well below the MMICUL. It is an upper limit after all. But sometimes developers can get a bit carried away with their promises and set consumer expectations too high for what the product will ultimately be by, for example, showing higher quality graphics in trailer footage or preview images than what consumers will see on their machines when finally running the released game. Similar to what we saw with the Dark Souls 2 lighting mechanic debacle. Cyberpunk 2077 is another example of this, with the marketing of the game hyping up many over an 8-year period to believe that its release would be roughly comparable to the Second Coming of Christ, but ultimately having its release plagued with glitches, bugs, undercooked mechanics, and a litany of seemingly missing content, with the PS4 version being so broken as to be pulled from the PlayStation Store. In this case, the developer CD Projekt Red has apologized for these issues and offered some refunds, only just recently returning it to the PS4 store, though with a distinct warning to still not play that version. But their credibility has taken a serious hit, and players are likely to remember the issues that plagued the game this company was perfectly comfortable selling them, not to mention the highly dubious practice of apparently restricting the footage reviewers were permitted to show in reviews before the game's release to several pre-approved, company-sourced gameplay clips, not being allowed to show their own recordings, with the obvious implication being to avoid having these players reveal the state that the game was truly in at release. And is that? Yup, it's our old friend Access Journalism back again. Cyberpunk may be fixed or improved over time, ironing out the bugs and adding content in patches or DLC, but one of the reasons people respected and trusted CD Projekt seemed to be because they were expected to be above these kinds of shady, post-hoc cleanup jobs that retroactively, if ever, make the game what was promised, which will be cold comfort to the many players who devoted time and energy to the game as it was when it released. Of course, the company felt pressure to get the game out ASAP, especially after such a long development time and 3 separate delays, but the reality is that, to say the least, they still needed more time. Consumer pushback, in a fair and constructive way, is natural and healthy for holding companies accountable. However, it does make you wonder if an internal reckoning is likely to happen, as CD Projekt's revenue from digital pre-order sales alone apparently exceeded all of Cyberpunk's production, marketing, and promotional costs, largely insulating them from immediate financial blowback from these issues. Although, since they couldn't hide the ball forever, the same can't be said for what's happened to the company's stock price since the game's launch. It makes you wonder what the situation would be like if there were no pre-orders and the game had to stand on the merit of its release version and make its pitch to consumers from there. How much healthier the AAA game economy might be if somehow the incentives were better aligned to keep these kind of launch day smash and grab schemes from working, even in the short term. A certain phrase comes to mind that seems applicable to this situation. I know I heard it somewhere. What was it again? Oh, right.
Personal responsibility.
There is a broader version of the MMICUL concept as well, that being the plain ol' ICUL, or intellectual complexity upper limit, which isn't solely applicable to media produced by modern technology, but applies to all kinds. Since mediums such as painting, novel writing, or the storied art of smoke signaling are typically defined by their practical limitations, while innovations within them can certainly occur, the complexity of those mediums themselves don't see much change over time. Or, to put it another way, the rules of the game are essentially set in stone from the start. Therefore, the progression of technology we've been discussing won't have much effect on the depth, meaning, or complexity of any of these closed systems or their ICUL coefficient. Take the game of chess as one example, where no matter what else were to happen or what discoveries are made, without fundamentally breaking the concept of what the game of chess is, there will always be exactly the same limit on the number of moves and positions the game can contain. Of course, that still leaves room for a great number of possibilities and unexpected occurrences within the rules of the game, which is why people can devote their lives to something like chess and continue to find enjoyment and meaning in doing so. As they do, the focus of these advanced players inevitably becomes a study of the numerous, though ultimately finite, possibilities within the game, and mastering them as much as they are able to. Progress in that field comes to be defined by exploring the boundaries of the game, uncovering new strategies that exist within ultimate limitations, and using those discoveries to enrich the culture surrounding the game. Now take this principle and apply it to a medium like painting, or writing, or smoke signaling, or anything else. At any given point in our MMICUL progression over time, there is an ICUL derived from the current state of technology. Just as there are limitations on physical media, as there are rules in games like chess, you can think of the limitations of our graphical capabilities, poly counts, computations per second, disk read speeds, pixel density, frames per second, internet connection speed, and so on in the same way, as rules to the game that you're playing at any given point in history. So while technology constantly progresses, at any given moment, when it comes time to develop software, you have 2 options. You can use what is currently available to you, or can choose to spend time and energy to develop additional tools to use in doing so. As one notable innovator put it,
"You don't invent technology and then figure out what to do with it. You come up with an artistic problem, and then you have to invent the technology in order to accomplish it."
So as available technology and the existing media landscape evolves, when it comes to the tools used to create that media, there will always be a balance to be found between innovating and using those that have been tried and tested. It's in finding the healthy medium between these two stances, the sweet spot, if you will, where we find what might be called efficiency, or simply trying to get the most out of the tools available. Never innovate and media will become stagnant, but focus too much on new for the sake of new in any particular aspect of a project, and you run the risk of deprioritizing the parts of your media which brought in the audience in the first place. It's important to pursue the right balance between these competing forces, or to put it another way, to maintain balance in the force. We know what happens when you don't. Part 4. Finding depth in any mechanic and prioritization. Within our terms MMICUL and ICUL, the phrase intellectual complexity specifically refers to how complicated or intellectually dense a given work can be. Needless to say, between 1972 when Pong was created and 2013 when GTA 5 released, the MMICUL value increased substantially, and thus developers have been able to exceed the intellectual complexity of a game of digital ping pong with software like the living world of Los Santos and the characters we interact with there. However, if you compare either of them to, for example, a text-based adventure game like Zork, which has plenty of content and can provide a great deal of intellectual stimulation, what makes Zork so much lower on the MMICUL scale is how the complexity inherent in play is limited to purely literary stimuli, while other games can provide more through the use of art, music, realized 2- or 3-dimensional worlds, character progression or customization, spatial reasoning information, reflexive stimuli, and so on. These are the features that have evolved in games as a medium in particular over time. However, are games that came out after Zork or Pong that have long since exceeded the MMICUL value of their day necessarily better? Of course not. The quality of a game can be totally separate from the complexity of the systems within it, as what matters is how the tools available are used and the meaning conveyed using them. Whether it's the satisfaction of clearing all lines on screen with a Tetris combo, fleeing in panic from Pyramid Head in Silent Hill 2, the struggle to land a perfect score in DDR, learning the truth behind Flowey in Undertale, or the sense of accomplishment that comes from earning the Gold Crown in Kingdom Hearts 2. There is a vast landscape of feelings games can provide to us, and what makes these moments special and last in our memories is, more than any other factor, their gaminess. How they uniquely took advantage of the component pieces used to construct them to give players rewarding experiences as only the interactivity of this medium can, as opposed to a singular focus on reaching as close to the current MMICUL value as possible for any aspect of the game. One way to think about it is how it might make more sense to develop a game landing somewhere around here on the MMICUL curve, as opposed to the bleeding edge here, so that more development time and energy can be used to enhance the experience in other ways, not just present a more impressive tech demo. Of course, it's overly simplistic to present available development resources as some kind of interchangeable currency to be placed in any game development aspect desired at the time, like some kind of skill tree. But at some level, management does need to decide the overall goals and priorities of a company for its products, which is where this kind of thinking can have an impact going forward. Consider, for example, the impressive rope physics of The Last of Us Part 2. As far as anyone can tell, this seems to be the best implemented, most realistic implementation of rope physics in gaming history, which does enhance the world of the game, and a fair number of people have taken note of it, although this mechanic does have its fair share of imperfections. But consider this question: was it worth implementing? In a game of this scale, where these rope physics are far from an essential mechanic, while I'm sure some coders and modelers out there are proud to have created this feature, why not ask, could that time have been better spent elsewhere? You can make a whole game out of just this one mechanic and really dig into it and explore its depths. But in a massive game like The Last of Us 2, it barely gets any time to shine, and so has a certain decadent feel to it. This isn't a criticism of the game or mechanic per se, it's just a kind of frustration that these kinds of technically impressive games can evoke in players. Which brings us again to the question, was it worth it? Of course, you can ask this question about any piece of any game, but that's the point. Why not do that? Just because a particular piece of a game exists and is an overall positive, it doesn't mean the time and energy used to create it was necessarily used in the best possible way. These are the questions of efficiency that can leave a game to feel like it isn't living up to its potential and leave a sour taste in the mouth of its players. After all, the MMICUL value only increases over time, making an overemphasis on approaching it not only inefficient, but often ironically coming to date a project as time goes on, as future projects that have more advanced technology will be able to achieve more impressive results. This leaves previous attempts at realism to pale by comparison, while games that abstract similar mechanics can circumvent the issue entirely. There is also the even worse scenario where pursuing a higher tech standard or more complex game design is not only inefficient, but actively cuts against the quality of the overall product. This can be done due to a desire of the developers to push the tech more for its own sake, or out of a desire to keep pace with perceived customer expectations. One commonly known expression of this is the uncanny valley effect, where humanoid designs that reach for realism but don't quite achieve the desired effect can produce an unnerved reaction from the audience, since humans are historically excellent at spotting imperfections in human designs. One design style that has become fashionable of late is the usage of body and motion capture technology to allow cinematically inclined directors to insert real-world actors into their fantasy worlds in as fully realized a way as possible. However, we are a long way from photorealism at present, so the illusion can only go so far, and the option to rely on original character design certainly has its advantages. How about the concept of voice acting? While we've long since developed the technology to support it and the storage capability necessary to hold files for a large number of voice tracks within games, the inclusion of voice acting is again a function that can be added at a developer's discretion if they feel it would add to their game, but is certainly not always beneficial. Especially in games with large voiced scripts, this is a major development burden for a studio to undertake, having to hire voice actors, supply them with completed scripts, and keep changes during development to a minimum to avoid any burdensome re-recordings. This is true enough for the game's native language, let alone any translations done for international releases. Some games, such as ICO, make up their own in-world languages, which avoids issues such as these, and while that is commendable, the practice is far from common. For some games, large amounts of voice dialogue can end up being a hindrance as well, as it's a common frustration for wordy series like Nippon Ichi games, where you can often read dialogue faster than characters speak and must choose between the annoyance of constantly cutting off their audio or politely waiting for them to finish speaking, wasting time. In circumstances like this, just plain text can be preferable, as a lack of voice acting can also allow for more player freedom in forming their interpretation of a character through their dialogue, and it can make for some awkward compromises when trying to have it both ways, as many of us who have followed gaming from the pre to post standardization of voice acting can attest. Speaking of Ueda games, this is a good chance to bring up the legitimate artistic merit that can be found in pursuing technological innovation or novel game design features to achieve a desired effect for your games, as anyone who has spent any time developing a game can tell you. ICO, for example, contained pioneering work in the inverse kinematics calculations used to animate ICO's legs independently on inclined surfaces and stairs, and in the bloom lighting effects that give the game an otherworldly feel. Functionally, these both serve to enhance atmosphere and immersion in the game, and I remember being incredibly impressed by both of them when I first played it almost 2 decades ago. Or in Shadow of the Colossus, how innovations in physics programming were necessary to allow Wander and the Colossi to collide and interact in carefully constructed ways such that Wander would tilt and shift realistically on top of them as they moved, but they could still be navigated as the game obstacles they were designed to be. Needless to say, these innovations are a big part of the reason that game is one of the most celebrated of its time, as well as one of the go-to examples of games as art. The point, of course, being that none of what I have said is to discourage commitment to the development of technology or innovations in game design, but just to pursue them with a purpose and vision to meaningfully enhance the world or experiences you are crafting for players without getting bogged down on wasteful trivialities or even dead-weight features, something the minimalist Ueda certainly succeeded at doing. More than any other factor, it is the human element of deliberate craft used to deliver carefully constructed experiences that matters, especially when it comes to video games. An element to consider when deciding how to develop games is our old friend cognitive capacity. Because as we've discussed, humans have a finite limit on how much they can keep track of in their minds at one time, which, where games are concerned, developers account for by making sure they don't ask too much of players when it comes to how much information they expect them to keep track of, how many decisions they are asked to make, or at what speed they are asked to perform. This is why, for one example, controllers are designed with only so many buttons. When you think about it, a controller could certainly be designed with double the buttons we typically have now. Just look at the keyboard used for PC gaming and consider, with so many options available, why is it that more of the buttons aren't typically used in gameplay? For a typical controller, there's a reason a comfortable consensus has emerged to give players 2 analog sticks, a D-pad, 4 face buttons, 4 shoulder buttons, start, select, and home buttons in recent generations. Because developers have found that this array of buttons generally gives them enough options for mapping the extent of the in-game functions they wish players to have access to, and players are given an adequate set of input options laid out in a digestible pattern. There are certainly game concepts that are designed around different types of input devices, including ones that are far more complex, but these can be intended for specialized audiences willing to take the additional time to learn the more complex controls. And so, as with the standard controller, managing players' willingness and capability to devote the time to master a set of controls or a game's particular challenges is always vital to the experience, because it's often in the balance of challenge and reward that the elusive fun lies.
Wait a minute, that card.
Psychologically speaking, oftentimes people prefer to have fewer options to pick from when making a decision, since too many can overwhelm the decision maker or make the options all seem less meaningful. Minecraft, a game largely built around the freedom to shape a world as you please, may be the most commercially successful game in history, but that certainly doesn't mean that people no longer want single-player, story-based experiences at all. We can get into some muddy territory here as to what complexity means when comparing these vastly different kinds of games, but the takeaway here is to say that clearly, complexity shouldn't always be top priority for every game. For whatever type of game you are making, what is always of paramount importance is player experience, in all its varied shades and styles. In the immortal words of Reggie,
"If it's not fun, why bother? Why bother? Why bother?"
Successful developers generally have the wisdom to keep these ideas in mind, but there can be serious consequences when they fail to keep balance in their development priorities in a healthy way. As a personal example, this is why a game like Final Fantasy V, to me, feels better to play than a modern title like Final Fantasy XV. While the older game has dated design elements and lacks a variety of quality of life improvements we have come to expect from games, the elements that do comprise it, despite their age, come together better to form a more cohesive, enjoyable experience, arrived at as a refinement to the gameplay of an established series. By comparison, while the technical achievements and complexity of Final Fantasy XV are obviously superior to its predecessor, in some ways this comes back to bite the game, as the actual control you have over the world feels proportionately smaller compared to the world you operate within. For example, movement of your avatar is obviously a necessary function to orient yourself in the worlds of both games, reach your destinations, and connect with other characters. But while movement in Final Fantasy V moves the character on a simplistic map grid it exists upon, animates your sprite momentarily, and may trigger a battle or cutscene, by comparison, movement in Final Fantasy XV sets off a series of behind-the-scenes calculations to animate your character appropriately, orient him in the 3D space he inhabits, checks to see if monsters have been aggroed, adjust the resolution of distant objects, and 1,000 other little checks and calculations. The point being that despite the movement action between the two games being the same on an input level, that action has far more complexity embedded into it in the latter game due to its fundamental design. However, has there been an equivalent increase in the meaning embedded in that action? For these animation effects, like the inverse kinematics we first saw in Ico, used to calculate Noctis's independent leg positions when walking over uneven surfaces. Certainly, they serve to add realism to the game, which can improve immersion and enhance the experience, but what meaningful game interaction does it provide? Not much, since it has lost its novelty and become an industry standard to be expected. So for Square Enix, for the next epic, numbered Final Fantasy release, it must be there in our cutting-edge new game. The most egregious example here is how, for all the action happening in combat, I always felt an almost insulting level of disconnect when playing Final Fantasy XV, as Noctis performed a complex series of movements and attacks while I simply held down one button. And while I enjoyed the organic tag team attacks your party would perform automatically, there is a certain autonomy-draining feeling in them along the lines of, am I even needed here? When the characters perform them totally outside my control. Or how you aren't able to move your party members out of harm's way unless you switch to controlling them, a feature I never had access to as it was cut from the game during development and only added back later in DLC. Old Final Fantasies like V actually did this mechanic better and gave you more control with the simple front-back row placement mechanic. When I'm looking for an immersive, growth-oriented RPG to play, I'll take an old-fashioned, simpler game like Bravely Default, or even Undertale, that gives me more meaningful control over my character's actions and a better player experience over this technical marvel of a snooze fest any day. To me, this is a typical case of misaligned priorities in design, driven by a company's perceived need to live up to customer expectations through graphics, gameplay style, and marketing. For all the polish and attempts to be immersive, do these countless animations of Noctis give him more personality or memorability compared to this one face from my boy Butts? I'll let you be the judge. On another point, take a series like Dynasty Warriors, the archetypal crowd brawler series, as the kids say. Just take a look at all the tomfoolery going on screen here, and the vast numbers of enemies being mowed down. Now, of course, more enemies must mean more complexity in game design and more cognitive demands of the player, as there are so many more variables to account for, yes? Well, actually no. In games like these, it quickly becomes apparent that most of the enemies in the field are, in effect, non-obstacles. Your character and their abilities so completely outclass the average troops set against you that functionally they serve more as target practice for your attacks, as repositories of health, money, points, or as a walking combo multiplier. Once you've finished mowing down fodder by the thousands, generally speaking, the actual threats you need to watch out for are the enemy commanders, opponents who have comparable health, power, and abilities to your character, and therefore actually pose a threat. Usually there are only a few of these active around you at any given time, because having too many real threats attacking at once becomes much more difficult for a player to manage. It can be asking too much of a player to account for all these variables at the same time and tip the balance from fun and challenging into unfair and tedious. So while there is a relatively large amount of technical complexity in the design of these sorts of games, considering the sheer number of animated, interactable objects rendered on screen, the cognitive load being asked of the player is generally far lower, as what is being asked of the player is more akin to flail about dispatching fodder until a challenge appears, then start thinking about what you're doing. The point being that game technical complexity can be totally divorced from intellectual complexity, which is more about how many systems and ideas are operating within a game, both of which are again separate from game quality or how much cognitive load is placed upon the player. It all comes down to good old-fashioned game design and how all the elements come together. That will forever be the most important factor for any multimedia experience and be squarely where the focus should remain for developers, consumers, and reviewers. Part 5. Why this matters and how to use MMICUL. Having said all of this malarkey, let's return to the all-important question. Why does any of this matter? What's the point of the MMICUL value? What's the big issue with hype culture? And why should you care about any of it? I'm so glad I asked on your behalf. As I said before, I've been trying for a long time to articulate a multifaceted problem I and many others see that involves advertising, hype culture, technological progress, corporate influence, jilted consumers, bad incentives, and so on. These issues have combined to create a problem within the media consumption oosphere, which, to put it simply, is a misalignment of priorities. The MMICUL concept is my attempt to create a tool that allows one to present all these points in one idea, which up to this point has not been articulated clearly, he said 15 pages later. But again, why should you care? Because of the downward spiral all of this creates long term. If bad games, good games, and great games all perform comparably well when simply given enough marketing, it puts all the incentive into focusing on that aspect of the business, which can mean focusing development on the most marketable aspects of products, which inevitably will come at the expense of what people came to the products for in the first place, and it's setting all of us up for a fall. Player enjoyment, or fun, is the foundation of the industry. People largely play games for escapism, after all, so whatever the intention of your game, player experience should always be the primary focus of development in its proper balance with innovation, or you will inevitably lose your purpose for making games in the first place. For example, a game like Watch Dogs disappointed many hyped players for a variety of reasons. Graphical downgrades, undercooked game world, underwhelming characters, but one of the major reasons was the false promise the game made to consumers to allow them to become a super hacker who could bend the city to their will, with fancy pants demos showing off the amazing ways you'll be able to combat your foes with all kinds of creative options, which is how the game was marketed leading up to release. However, once released, the game came across more like a GTA clone where you could occasionally press square to make something blow up. While there were some amusing elements to the game, the actual creativity and control you as a player were able to exercise felt seriously limited, largely because the central hacking mechanic left you with an all too limited selection of hacking options with limited consequences to each of them. Since this was an open world game, you won't be committing much of the city to memory, and so the game had to be designed with that in mind. Instead of having players intelligently use their knowledge of the environment to their advantage, it inevitably falls back to an approach of constantly having players scan their surroundings haphazardly for whatever hackable devices happen to be available. It's true, this free-form approach might make for some enjoyable emergent gameplay, but this comes at the cost of putting a limit on the experience players had primarily expected of feeling like a smart, powerful hacker in control of their city. The minimization of this, the primary selling point of the game, put a low ceiling over how much agency players could feel in their gameplay, and therefore how satisfied they could feel as a result. Watch Dogs wasn't supposed to be just another GTA clone, but that's largely what we got. The hype around the game unfortunately turned out to be misplaced, and when you look back on the promises Ubisoft made and think about how much deliberate craft and effort it would take to make the game we envisioned real, you can see how expectations for the game became way too high. Games like Spore and Fable also made big claims for themselves, and while they weren't terrible games that did nothing to innovate, they were ultimately grounded in familiar game systems that had previously existed. The point being, when a developer tells you they are revolutionizing game design, it's a very healthy practice to consider their track record and if they're likely to deliver the revolution they promise, or if the excitement they are selling might just be a marketing tool or even plain old overconfidence. And if you were disappointed only after the release of a product, it's at least a good idea to keep that in mind for the developer's next big hype campaign and to apply a critical lens in general when looking at game marketing. As gaming has become a bigger and bigger industry, and developers' perceived technological customer expectations have risen, it has led to companies devoting more and more resources to fewer projects, praying that these gargantuan releases continue to be hits and make back not just their massive development budgets, but oftentimes their even larger marketing budgets. As financial risk is being consolidated across the industry, with more effort and capital concentrated into fewer projects, the risk continually grows even for the companies making those juggernauts. A notable indie game scene does exist, but at the moment it seems that there are basically two camps: indie or AAA, with less and less in between. You could say that the gaming middle class, or middleware, is being squeezed out of the market, and that's bad for everybody, as there is so much fertile ground to be found in that space. Naturally, graphics are a key metric in what the gamosphere considers when it comes to new releases. But while a desire to improve graphics isn't inherently bad, it should be asked if the degree of focus they get is beneficial for the product, company, and beyond that, the industry, considering that the goal here, surely, is to make better games, not movies. When it comes to graphics, the reality is they are simply the easiest part of a game to market to the lowest common denominator consumer base, and therefore there is a strong incentive to make them a very high development priority. Some companies like Square Enix have famously admitted to an obsession with impressive graphics, but the problem in my mind isn't the obsession by any particular party. It's simply a cultural hegemony pushed forth on all sides by marketers, PR firms, ad companies, and reviewers to stick with what works, and as a result, developers are less willing to take risks and flex their creativity. Much of the problem in my mind stems from the fact that these companies do not know how to market games on anything other than what the lowest common denominator consumer will instantly be able to see and appreciate: graphics. But it seems to me that it should be obvious that graphics are nowhere near the most important factor when making a video game. Or, to put it another way,
as for the poly count, who the hell cares? It's artistry that counts. What about the artistry count?
consider the state of pixel art in modern gaming. While once the only game in town, it has become a declining art form, largely out of fashion these days, in favor of styles such as traditional 2D art or the more economical 3D model animation, not to mention the increasing ability to algorithmically recreate pixel effects. But does that mean that pixel art has become less of an art form? Of course not. In the same way that Disney's usage of 3D animation in their recent films might be more efficient, that doesn't make them artistically superior to their classic 2D animation, which comes down to a question of taste, style, and the economic viability of the art form. That being the same as how low-poly 3D art is artistically preferable to some compared to the realism arms race we are witnessing in the AAA scene. Looking at the amazing animation created by pros as pixel art reached its peak and began to fade away in the 2000s, and what people have done with it since, there is clearly vast potential in that style of artwork, with its own merit that appeals to some of us more so than other modern styles of animation. And who knows what more can be done with it given time and focus. But the popularity and efficiency of styles such as 3D animation have made them dominant, even when there is a sacrifice in the artistry and, dare I say, soul of the work. This is just one example of a particular art style abandoned by the AAA market in favor of newer, cheaper, more marketable content. There are economic factors behind it, but there is no reason for those who are interested in more of what we've lost here to not clamor for it and make that desire known to companies that might serve it. However, there are still occasions where, indie or otherwise, little miracles occur with games like Hollow Knight, that are made by small teams with small budgets, but deliver innovations on classic formulas that make you dream about what the industry might look like if it continued at large to evolve older game styles, instead of shifting focus almost entirely to new styles made available to them through updated tech. As technological progression continues to accelerate around us, it may be inevitable, but this is where, ideally, there would be a balance found between iteration and innovation. After all, working within limitations does seem to have a way of inspiring creativity in artists. But to get down to the heart of this issue, consider a modern game like Kingdom Hearts 3. As a game concept famously combining the unlikely pair of Final Fantasy and Disney, emphasis on the Disney, this series has always had plenty of bait for fans of those series, along with fans of the increasingly nonsensical plot. However, those factors, while certainly an initial draw, aren't what have kept people such as myself playing these games for thousands of hours over decades. That factor has more to do with the incredible gameplay of the series. But the all-important question is, how do you market that? I'll stop you right there and tell you, you can't. Not in the traditional sense, anyway. The specifics of a game that make or break how good, fun, or rewarding it is, especially where core gameplay is concerned, are often quite nuanced so that you generally need a large amount of information to make a determination as to their quality. And even with the modern advertising tools of online digital reviews available along with things like Let's Plays that can give potential players insight into the game, oftentimes it still requires a person to actually play the game themselves to decide if it is fun or enjoyable for them. There are some methods that can be used to address this gap, such as the declining art of the game demo, but even that method requires potential players to already have a strong interest in the game, and compared to the raw, attention-grabbing power that simple TV or internet advertising can have, it's generally going to be a drop in the bucket. In short, the more time and energy it takes to convey information about a game to a potential buyer, the more of them will tune out, and thus the emphasis must always be on appealing to the lowest common denominator customer. Was Kingdom Hearts 3 advertised as a game where you'll be able to face off against super-powered versions of your strongest foes, balanced on the razor's edge as you expend dozens of attempts to defeat them for the ultimate satisfaction not only of victory, but perfecting your combat style against them, until your mastery of the game has them dancing like puppets in your hands? No. It was advertised as the game where Sora will hang out with Goofy, Donald, and Big Hero 6. Why not Big Heroes 1 through 5? I guess we'll never know. When it comes to marketing, and really all forms of consumer-developer relationships, I want to drive one point home. There's a certain attitude that some groups of consumers have towards some developers that never exists in reverse, that being a blind faith in them, born out of all kinds of factors. But ask yourself, do we really want to put blind faith in the developers' hands to do with whatever they want? Is that a healthy relationship to have in any other situation? For both parties? Because it is simply a fact that consumers have a naturally antagonistic position towards producers, and vice versa, with naturally conflicting interests. These days, it's all the rage for companies to act like your hip friends who totally get it on their public face and social media presences. But this is a crafted illusion. It's what marketing departments exist to do, make you feel that way. The companies that make your favorite products are not your friends. Their goal is to take as much money from you for as little time and effort as possible, just as it is the consumer's goal to milk as much quality product out of producers for as little cost as possible. This is neither moral nor immoral, it's simply fundamental to economics. And while it's true there is an increasing element of ideological pressure companies seem to feel obligated to cater to, it's wise to be wary of these signals of virtue, even if you agree with their current execution, because they often bear the signs of being a calculated response designed to allow the company to operate as they always have while simply appeasing current cultural concerns with a few cheap slogans, rather than be a thought-out ethical standard implemented to make the world a better place as they see it that might include some meaningful or even costly action. They aren't activists, so don't be fooled when they pretend to be, because when it serves their purposes, they'll cut a different way. They call that being ultra-crepidarian. So as a consumer, it's a good idea to be cautious before making ethical evaluations of amoral entities. You can choose to ignore these facts and act as if companies are your pals who have your best interests foremost in mind, but if you do, you'll just be making yourself vulnerable to being taken advantage of. As informed consumers, let's try not to do that. I'm not suggesting any one individual can have some great impact on these systems one way or another. I'm simply suggesting that we, as a demographic, keep the economic realities of our situation in mind, because every relationship is healthier when both parties are critical, thinking participants who hold the other accountable for their actions. I think that's sufficient time spent on the why behind the issues within our MMICUL conundrum, but I wanted to point out some ideas to get you thinking about it in practice. The multimedia intellectual complexity upper limit represents an idea as to the consequences of failing to design with player enjoyment foremost in mind, and devoting excessive time and energy to making fancier, more technically advanced media as all parties get diminishing returns. This is an idea I would like consumers, and perhaps more importantly, developers, to keep in mind. The idea of diminishing returns and feature creep is nothing new, but it's their relationship with the expectations of consumers and our malignant hype culture that has created such an abundance of bad incentives and negativity in the market. So now you know what the MMICUL is and the problem I'm trying to address with it. There's no simple solution to this kind of issue, as it involves multiple factors across the industry, but hey, the first step to fixing a problem is generally to point it out. I'm hoping shedding light on these issues as I see them will help people to push back against bad market incentives in their own respectful, useful ways. It's possible that drifting priorities is the inevitable cycle of art-made industry, but at this point in time, I think it's the rapid progress in tech that has created business incentives to focus on what often turn out to be creative dead ends. Fancy bells and whistles, such as cutting-edge graphics, may be easy to market here and now, but they don't age well if that's the primary attraction. Compare Jurassic Park to Jurassic World. Obviously, the original can't compete with our modern CG animation technology, but you show them both to a group of kids, and I'll bet you my dear sweet mother's ransom money that they'll walk away singing the praises of old JP and the T-Rex due to the craft and artistry that blows out soulless CG any day. The world is changing quickly, and the people's interest and patience has its own upper limit. So for the sake of the industry, I hope at some point a reprioritization is done, and in all likelihood, it will be up to us as consumers to be the force that enables that. You can try chasing the top of the curve as much as you please, but ultimately, that's never been what keeps the people coming back for more. Woo! Well, here we are, gang. Time for our end of the video ramble. Sorry for the wait on this one, but truth be told, this has been the hardest script I've ever had to write for a video, and it took me a while to complete. Not because any of the ideas in here are particularly high level or complicated, but because with the MMICUL project, my goal was to take a bunch of tangentially related, swirling thoughts I've had about video game and general media consumption culture, and hammer them into something resembling a coherent idea, and more importantly, one that is, I hope, actually useful. It took me a while to pin these ideas down as I tried to fully realize and solidify my own nebulous thoughts, and to decide how I wanted to present everything. And while I'm excited to get your feedback as to whether you think MMICUL is a good idea, or maybe not so much, I really hope my little MMICUL chart here is helpful, even as just a framing device, for getting people to understand how some of us look at the media generation machine we're faced with today. It's a huge relief to finally get it out there, because in a few ways, this video has been a roadblock for me and my channel for a while. One that I felt a compulsion to complete before I turned my attention to other projects. Kind of like a meteor ominously hanging in the sky above, needing to be addressed. I felt compelled to put it all together as kind of a way to define my terms about a few things before moving on. But now it's out there, and I hope you get something out of it. To that end, I've got a little something for you. In the interest of MMICUL being an idea I hope gets around, I decided to enlist the services of the one and only Kaiju-kun to bring to life some of the situational examples discussed in the video in the context of our MMICUL concept. These 6 pieces were made to represent ideas reflecting some of its various facets. So, if you'd like to keep some of them in mind wherever you go, why not bring them with you in the form of a MMICUL t-shirt or sticker? Available now on the BGE Teespring store. Each of them has been lovingly crafted, with familiar scenes mathematically designed to make you think about video games. So I'd say getting one should at least double your IQ. They'll let you rep MMICUL, and it's a great way to support my work here as YouTube's premier video game intellectual. But if those don't float your boat, as always, you can support this channel and my work by pledging to my Patreon or Subscribe Star pages. In addition to keeping me alive and making videos like the high-quality content you've just seen here, you can get access to the BGE private Discord of like-minded individuals, get your name in video credits like the fine folks you can see here, and of course, get access to bonus content in the form of the BGE Monthly Cast, my personal little podcast, which, if I do say so myself, is pretty damn sick. Now is a particularly good time to take the monthly cast pill, as this month's episode will feature plenty of behind-the-scenes MMICUL info and discussion of my thought process in making it that perhaps you might find interesting. That will be out in a day or two after this video, so go pledge $5 to get that, or $10 to get into the Q&A. See the Patreon for more details. Onegai shimasu. But hey, if instant gratification is more of your thing, I will also be streaming today at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time over on twitch.tv/definitely bestguyever. If you aren't interested in pledging recurring support, then why not come stop by, talk, ask some questions, and maybe give me a tip for my top-tier work regarding ethics in games journalism so I can respond to it live. Ha, isn't it generous, all the different ways I'm giving you guys to support me? I know, it's fantastic. I'll be playing through the Neo Twoey demo while we talk about MMICUL stuff, and hopefully clearing up anything not addressed in the video. So, come stop by later. Thank you everyone for watching and for all the support. One last time, I'll stress, I hope you find the MMICUL concept to be a useful tool, since that is its intended purpose. If you think others might get something out of MMICUL, I encourage you to let them know about it and to share this video around. This whole exercise was an attempt to do a little bit more for the community than just my usual kind of general media commentary, and to give something a little meatier back. So I sure hope it has that effect. Thanks again everyone, and I'll see you soon.